Every single angler, besides maybe small children, is using one of these, a bait casting rod or a spinning rod to catch fish. But when putting fresh fishing line on your bait casting and spinning reels, you've got to do it the right way, following the best practices to set them up properly and save yourself heartache later. But what is the best way to put fishing line on a fishing reel? My name's Tyler, so let's talk about it.
Another giant, another giant. Look at that, y'all.
I can't believe what I just caught.
Yes!
So I bet I can guess that you have a fishing reel that's in need of some line, or you went to the store, picked it up, and the line that came on your rod and reel is probably not the best quality. Let's talk about how to put the line on your rods and reels the right way, starting first with the spinning combo. This right here is a brand new Lew's Mock Jacked spinning combo. It's in need of some line. So my general spinning line setup consists of three things. We have a thin monofilament backing line, a relatively thin 10 to 15 pound Seaguar braided line, and then a really thin fluorocarbon leader. This here is Seaguar Gold Label. And I choose all three of these here because I usually just throw finesse-y type stuff on my spinning combo. So if you throw a heavier line, maybe a 12, 15 pound fluorocarbon monofilament, the tips that I'm going to teach you on how to spool the line on here properly still apply, but I'm a huge advocate for a braid to a fluorocarbon leader on your spinning rods, and so that's what I'm going to put on this one. The first step to take before you ever even put backing line on is to tighten down your drag, because if you are spooling your line on there and you feel your drag slip at all, the line is not going on there as tightly as it could. So I tighten my spinning rod drag down, I mean not like all the way, but to where it probably can't move hardly at all. The next step is to take your thin monofilament fishing line that you're going to use as your backing and tie it tightly onto the spool. Now, why do I use backing, especially cheap monofilament line backing, on my reels? And again, I do it on both my spinning rods and my bait casting. The biggest reason is because it saves money. If you're using a high quality braided line, this here is Seaguar Smackdown, it's expensive stuff. On the bait caster, we're gonna put on Seaguar Invisex. It's an expensive fluorocarbon line, very high quality. I wanna use as much backing as I can, because for the majority of your fishing life on a reel, the bottom line is never going to see the light of day. It's never going to see action. And so I fill up a certain portion, depending on the reel size of my reels, with a cheap monofilament line. It serves as a strong base for the main fishing line on your reel. And so that's why I put backing on first, for no other reason than to save money. So I'm going to back up a little bit here so y'all can see a little more of what I'm doing. I've also got a second camera angle going. So I'm going to put the spool of monofilament down. I'm going to open up the bail, of course, and then I'm going to tie just some kind of, I mean, it can be several overhand knots, it can be a fancy Boy Scout knot. I tie, I believe what's called a 2/2 hitch, if I remember correctly, but it just goes over twice on the inside and then over once on the outside, and it should cinch down tight to the spool. If your spool doesn't have any kind of teeth like this one has right here, as you can see on this shot, then you may have to put masking tape or duct tape down to have your line really tight to it. But this here has a line ready spool, so that's great. Grab my scissors, grab the tag end and snip it off as close as I can. And you might notice I did not feed my line through any of my guides, and that's because when I'm first spooling on my backing line, I really don't care a whole lot about the direction it goes on, because again, this line is just serving as a backing, as a base. Hopefully it won't fly off the spool, and so I basically just put it on the spool like this, grab the line up the rod, and then keeping tension on it, just kind of stick the rod in my crotch there. I start reeling just like this, again, keeping tension up here. That way the line is going on as tightly as possible. My fingers are kind of burning. I'm gonna go a little slower. And I'm gonna keep spooling the backing line on there until it gets to about 3/5 of the spool. Again, this is purely to save money and just act as a good hard base. I'm gonna talk about why I use the 6 pound here in a second. And that right there looks like the perfect amount. Now, of course, if you just let go of the line, monofilament, especially when spooled on the wrong direction, can fly off of your reel. So I'm gonna keep tension as I grab it right here. And now I'm actually going to open up the bail, give myself a little extra line. Again, keeping the tension so it doesn't fly off. And now I'm going to stick it through the first guide only. Right there, there's the first guide, line is going through, and I can kind of set this rod down right here as I keep the tension on to get my braided main line. If you're struggling with keeping the tension on the line, use your teeth. I've now got my braided line right here. Gonna grab the line and just tie a simple double uni knot, whatever connection knot you like. I mean, the FG is the best connection knot out there, but you don't have to tie an FG to go from your backing line to your main line. So I'm just gonna go 1, 2, 3, 4 wraps. Again, if I'm ever casting all the way down to my backing knot, something's wrong. I don't have enough main line. Now, going back to the question of why I use 6-pound monofilament as my backing line, and the answer is because the line diameter is so thin that practically no matter what main line you're using, unless you're getting like 40, 50-pound braid, the knot, the connection knot, as you can maybe even see there on the B-roll shot, is so stinking tiny, it's never going to get in the way of your line coming off the spool. It's just gonna bury itself and you won't even know it's there. So that's why I use 6-pound monofilament as my backing. We have tied the double uni knot. I'm gonna go ahead and snip the ends, again, even closer maybe than I would if I was tying a braided fluorocarbon leader that actually sees action on the water. I wanna leave a little more tag for that, but for this one, I can cut it right next to it. And that right there is my backing to main line. So now it's time to put the main line on your spinning reel. I've got it down there on the boat deck. Braided line has 0 memory at all, so it really doesn't matter which direction, unlike a baitcaster, it comes off the spool. Oftentimes, I'll just kind of let it fly around. There it is. As I, again, keep tension with this hand on the line going on the spool. I don't really care where it goes. It could fly off into the woods for all I care. And I can't stress how important it is to keep the tension on there with your hand. You could have a buddy hold the spool, put the spool between your toes, as you'll see here in a second, but for a spinning rod, I just like to hold the rod and keep the tension as it spools manually. Now, one thing you wanna make sure you don't do is spool too much. So I'm gonna look at my spool every once in a while, and as soon as I see the line get close to where the spool starts to angle up, it goes from a flat spool to a little bit of an angle to a high angle. That's right where I want to stop my line. So I'm going to get a B-roll photo to show you exactly where your braid, your main line on a spinning reel should stop. And I'm about there right now. And now it's time to snip this line and put on my fluorocarbon leader. And it's at this point you can loosen up your drag. That way you can pull some line out and feed it through all the guides. And like I said, it's time now to put the fluorocarbon leader on your braided line, but this is not a video about how to put a leader on a line. It's about how to spool your reels, and we are done with the spinning reel. Again, super easy. Doesn't really matter, especially if you're using braid, which direction the line comes off the spool. I'll kind of touch on a resin line for a second. If your line is coming off of the spool this way, you want it going on the spinning reel the same exact way. So if it comes off this way, you want it going on the spool this way. So oftentimes if I'm using a full length resin line as my main line, I will lay it on the ground totally flat. But now let's move on to putting line on the bait casting reel. Now the line setups I use on a baitcaster vary dramatically. I go 10-pound line to 25-pound line. I throw 65, 50-pound braided line, but on this combo today, the Lew's Elite TI combo, I'm gonna use 20-pound Seaguar Invisex. I'm gonna kind of flip a Texas rig and a jig around with this thing around shallow cover and docks. And so the 2 lines I need, again, are the 6-pound backing line and the 20-pound main fluorocarbon line. Let's go for it. Step number 1 is to put the backing line through the eye of your baitcasting reel. It can be difficult to do, and what's even more difficult is getting the line around your spool to tie a knot. Some spools have lots of slots, some are mostly or totally flat, and so you have to use whatever method you find best to get that line underneath and around the spool. So I shove the line either through the spool, this Elite TI here has a lot of slots, or go totally underneath, grab a pair of scissors or tweezers and grab the line and bring it over. Like I said, however you can get it through, the better. Then I'm gonna tie my backing knot. A bunch of overhand knots works, or any fancy Boy Scout knot. I tie a 2/2 hitch, 2 times through the inside, 1 time through the outside. Cinch that knot down all the way on the spool. And when it comes to putting a knot on your spool, I like to try to hide the knot inside of any of the grooves that the spool has. I put the knot right there, I hold my finger, and I pull on the line, and that gets that knot tight down in one of the grooves. Once that's done, I take my scissors, I cut pretty dang close to the knot, and now I can start reeling in my backing line. Now, the most important part of putting line on a bait casting reel is that the direction of how the line is spooled on matters. So if the spool is winding in line this way, I want the line to come off the spool this way. So for both my backing and my main line, I'm gonna make sure if I'm reeling and the spool's turning over towards me, the spool is also turning towards me. So make sure you're keeping track of that, whether you're putting line on yourself or you're having somebody hold the spool with a pen, with a pencil or a pen or a Sharpie in the holes of your Crocs. There's lots of ways to do it. The best way that I have found to do it is to put it in between my toes. And as you can see, I have the spool right there with the 2 holes with my big toes holding each side. I'm gonna still hold the line above the reel, similar to the way I held the spinning line on there, and just to give it a little bit extra pressure, and I'm gonna start spooling my backing on just like that. And the faster you go, the more your toes burn. I would highly recommend wearing socks when doing this, because if you don't, I'm telling you, your toes are gonna burn off. Now, the amount of backing line to put on your bait casting reel is determined solely by the line diameter of the main line you are using. So for 20-pound line, I go to about 3/5 or a half of the spool of backing line. If it is 10-pound main line, I'm gonna go like 4/5 of the spool, just enough to give yourself maybe 1.5 full cast lengths. That's all the main line you need. Again, the backing line is used to save money. So my backing line has now reached a little over halfway on my baitcaster right here. It's not as important to keep the tension on it on a baitcaster as it is a spinning rod. Resin lines don't jump as easily on these ones as the spinning ones do. Again, very similar to the spinning rod, I'm gonna tie the smallest little double uni knot that I can, and the 6-pound backing line to the 20-pound fluorocarbon definitely has a small enough knot. Way better than if I was to use like 12-pound backing line to a 20-pound main line. If you're targeting a fish species that's gonna pull drag all the way down to your backing line, don't worry about putting backing on, just put, full-size line. But for bass, I'm all good. Backing knot is tied. Again, snip it as close as I can. That way no little ends are poking out. If you have ends poking out or a big knot, oftentimes the connection knot way down deep in your spool can actually come up and cause backlashes almost every single cast. So you want the smallest knot possible with no tag ends sticking out. And one more small best practice I do with my backing knot before I start reeling my main line in is I make sure that as I'm reeling, that backing knot ends up on the middle. If I was to start reeling right now, this backing knot would end up on the left side of my spool. I don't want that. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna pull line out, engage my spool, see where it lands. Oh, still a little bit too left. I'll pull a little more line out. Again, put my fingers right here to give it some tension. And it looks like right there, the knot is now perfectly center in the reel. Now it's time to have somebody else hold the spool or hold it tightly yourself and spool on your main line. And once you have reached the point where the bait casting spool, again, I'll show you a picture on the screen here, goes from flat to angling out, that's how you know you have a full spool of line. It is best to have a full spool all the time. That way your gear ratio actually means what it says it means and you get the best casting distance. And that right there is how to spool a bait casting reel. My goodness, folks, that was a lot of information, but I hope you learned something. And of course, I teach you guys really practical things here on this channel, and putting line the right way on your bait casting and spinning reels will definitely save yourself heartache later. The biggest things, I'll kind of overview real quick. The biggest things are tension, are tying good knots, and using small backing line. Again, if you care about saving money like I do. Now, since this video consisted of both a spinning rod and a baitcaster, I made a video comparing and contrasting what both of these rod combos are best for, in my opinion, as a bass fisherman. I will leave that video up here in this corner. My name is Tyler. My goal is to help you guys catch more fish and become better anglers. Hopefully, we'll see you guys next time right here on TRF.